Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva, and today we are speaking with Dr. Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna. Dr. Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna is the Director of Global Privacy for the Future of Privacy Forum, where she leads the work on global privacy developments and European data protection law and policy, with their impact on all focus areas of FPF, including de-identification, AI, mobility, ad tech, and education. Certainly, all areas where I think many people are starting to pay more attention to. She holds a PhD in law with a thesis on the rights of the data subject from the perspective of their adjudication in civil law, and an LLM in human rights. She is a contributor author to the EU General Data Protection Regulation, a commentary, uh, and that's it. There we go. Dr. Gabriela, thanks for taking the time to be here today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I do have the commentary somewhere in the video here. See the
Okay,
big
nice.
purple book there. It's
As, as most government related documents are like 700 pages, triple bound. Nice.
yes.
That's a good thing to kill bugs with if and also to maybe to hit a thief over the head if somebody tries to break into your home.
Yes, it serves multiple purposes.
Good. And I'm sure it's a good read too, of course. So let's get into it now. Now that we know you have a tome behind you there, what is the future of privacy forum?
Well, the Future of Privacy Forum is a nonprofit organization that serves as catalyst for privacy leadership and scholarship. We advance principled data practices in support of emerging technologies. So, to put it in simpler words, we are data optimists. So we
Hmm,
believe that data can bring data and technology, new technologies can bring a lot of good things to society and to people, but at the same time, we promote responsible data practices and practices that actually take into account and respect individuals' rights and interests.
cool. I'm sure there are a few organizations I would love to put you in touch with. Whether they'd be eager to be to be in touch with you is a whole other thing. What led you to join the Future Privacy Forum and inspired you to pursue a career in this space?
Well, I am a very big privacy geek. Or data protection geek, if I'm to think of the term we use in the European Union. Because there we are speaking both of data protection as a right and privacy as a different right that deserves protection. So I actually immediately after law school started to research data protection law. I found it fascinating. I got to it because I was interested in privacy, in surveillance. I come from Eastern Europe, from Romania, and we have a totalitarian past there. Surveillance was a big part of the lives of my family. And of everyone else's family for that matter before
Yeah.
1989. So I was hearing lots of stories from my grandparents, from my parents, on how intrusive it was to be, subject of constant surveillance. This is what got me interested in these topics generally. And then in law school, I discovered also the fascinating world of data protection in the European Union. So I just kept on studying it for my master's in human rights and then for my PhD, particularly in data protection law. And this is how I started in the field. So at FPF, I arrived about 5 years ago after I
Mhm.
moved to the United States. And before that, I used to work in Brussels for the European Data Protection Supervisor, which
Oh,
is a regulator actually. It's an enforcer of data protection law for the European Union bodies, agencies, and how they should respect data protection law over there. But it's also an advisor to the European Union Parliament, Commission, Council when they adopt legislation. And to just make the story full and round, I used to be in Brussels working for the EDPS when the General Data Protection Regulation, the famous GDPR, was being debated, discussed,
Hmm.
adopted, amended, and so on before being adopted. And I feel I was so lucky to be part of that conversation and to be able to advise the people that were actually working on the regulation. And after I moved to the US, FPF seemed like a very, very good, probably the best choice for me to explain, how this GDPR works in practice and to engage with the community of privacy professionals here in the US.
Yeah, I will say I was in Europe just a couple of weeks ago. I was in Paris, France, and that experience. I haven't flown to the Europe in a while, and so I think arising out of this greater awareness of privacy in general in Europe, um, I flew Air France. It was operated by KLM, so technically I flew KLM on the way there and Air France on the way back. And one thing I noticed that I wasn't really expecting, but as soon as I thought about it, totally made sense, was signs on the plane that said, you're not allowed to take photos of the staff, of other passengers, etc. Like, really, no photos of anybody else on the plane. You want to take your photos of yourself, go for it. Obviously, the sign was not that verbose, but the point was, like, the staff have a right to privacy. They'll allow to do their work in peace, and so no photos, please, of the staff or other passengers. And I was like, oh, that's probably maybe not a GDPR specific thing or related thing, but
Yeah.
like certainly a policy probably coming out of that frame of mind. And I was like, oh, okay, that's different for me, but really interesting. And certainly, and I saw some similar signs at the airport, at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris as well, about basically just keep your photo to yourself. Take a selfie, and that's
Yes.
about it if that's what you want to do. Um, if you don't mind me asking, you said your family, your grandparents and your parents talked to you quite a bit about what it was like to be under this totalitarian repressive regime, a lot of surveillance. Without getting into too many specifics, like, what was your general sense of how that impacted them? Because I don't get a chance to talk to a lot of people who have actually lived in that sort of situation.
Well, it was a very difficult time generally for them.
Hmm.
And what made things even worse was that I mean, even if it was so difficult for families to live through those times, to give you some examples, especially in the last part of the 80s, there was scarcity of food. You would have, a card that would say you have the right to loaves of bread for that
Right.
week, or things like that. So everything was rationed, right? So there was scarcity of food, there was scarcity of resources to heat buildings during winter. There was scarcity of a lot of things. And what made it actually much worse was that people were not even able to freely talk about it because they were afraid of repercussions.
Mm.
So the fact that they knew, there might be informants everywhere among neighbors or
Mm.
who knows, colleagues at work. There was this constant fear of constantly being heard whenever you speak. They were thinking, what if my phone is, tapped
Tapped, yeah.
into? And there was literally this constant feeling of um, being observed, listened to, and that would have had terrible consequences. If you were too critical, or actually critical towards the regime, or if you would plan to leave the country on some crazy way. There were some very unsafe ways to sort of run away from the country. But
Yeah.
so if they would hear that you planned those, there were terrible consequences. So what stuck with me was this impact on freedom of speech, impact on your free will. Um, and when I say impact, I speak of the impact of knowing you are constantly surveilled,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if maybe maybe someone was not really listening into you, but the fact that you sort of internalized that fear had very very bad consequences on everyone's peace of mind.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that must feel like. And I think, I mean, we still see some of that right now. There's this, I haven't dug much into it, but this story of this Belarusian sprinter who all of a sudden is told, like, you need to come home, you need to come home right away. Thankfully, her grandmother calls her and says, "Do not come home. They're saying very nasty things about you on the news. You might go to prison as soon as you get on, like, land back in city. The name of the city is failing at Minsk or something like that."
Yes,
And
Minsk, yeah.
like, like even now we still see, not, well, maybe outside of China and Russia, like, not widespread really hardcore surveillance, but it's definitely still there. It's and it's even more insidious in some ways, because you could be, you're outside of Romania, maybe all of a sudden, for some reason, the Romanian government, if they decide to go backwards again,
To flip
um,
the switch.
yeah, flip the switch, go backwards 30, 40 years, and start behaving in a similar way again. uh you wouldn't know, probably not, unless you were really tuned into Romanian media, and then all of a sudden you land, and in at an international airport in Bucharest or something like that, and all of a sudden, you got handcuffs on you, and you have no idea why, and could be something totally innocuous that you said on a podcast or something like that. um and meanwhile, the government's just decided to be, I'm going to, pardon my French, and say a bunch of dickheads, and, like, and just clamp down, as opposed to working on fixing things or making people's lives better or something like that. So Belarus definitely has some issues to sort out there. Um, if not, I
Oh
think
yes.
the next, what is it called? The next Olympics, the Refugee Olympic Committee, might swell in numbers even further. It's already a few hundred this year.
Yes, indeed, some terrible things happened there, and I have to say that there was a lot of the public opinion in Romania resonated with what's happening to Belarusians
Hmm.
in the aftermath of that entire elections debacle. And indeed, the society back home is actually very sort of still sensitive about
Yeah.
these issues. And this is where it's so important to have democratic checks and balances, to have rule of law in a jurisdiction, in a country, so that things like that can never happen, like literally hijacking a plane with someone because of what they said or wrote,
Yeah.
because this is what happened in the past. But sort of we can shift away from that, but I think it's actually important to keep in mind that the democratic checks and balances, the rule of law, having a legal order, and having safeguards for how your personal information, your telecommunications are accessed, is absolutely vital. So I
Yeah.
think what you're doing with the podcast and linking all of this to democracy and democratic values is really really important. And before giving away the mic, just to mention that thankfully, I don't think Romania will soon be in that position, because we've been a member of the European Union since 2007, and we are amongst the most optimistic EU citizens, I would say.
Hmm.
There's no sort of exit feeling around people back home. So fingers crossed. I think everything is safe from that point of view.
That's good to hear. I know some wonderful Romanians. I definitely do not want to see Romania backtrack in that way. So bringing this way back to the FPF and some of the work you do there, what has been the toughest challenge you faced in global privacy developments and the European protection law and policy?
I think, well, from my point of view as a policy analyst, and someone that's trying to be smart about everything that's going out there, the biggest challenge I have is actually keeping track of all developments. It's
Mm,
really incredible how many things are happening on all sorts of directions. So we have new laws that are constantly being proposed around the world
yeah.
that are inspired by the GDPR, so data protection type of laws. Then we have, if we look at Europe, we are starting to see an obvious ramping up of enforcement of the GDPR. So there are
Hmm.
very interesting cases almost every day. So we had a very big fine issued in Spain against a supermarket, I think last week, like
Okay.
2.5 million euros fine for because they deployed a facial recognition system that was deemed to be too intrusive within the supermarket, and I can give you a
Yeah.
bit of details about the case. So that's what, and this is just one of the very interesting cases that
Yeah.
happened in the
One
past
case,
2 weeks.
one company, one country. Meanwhile, you have
Yes.
26, 27 other member states with dozens or hundreds of companies that are all thousands of companies that are all affected. So yeah, that's just one case out of probably dozens that could be investigated right now.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say, keeping track and making sense of all of these developments is the biggest challenge of my job.
Okay, that makes sense. So, how does the Future of Privacy Forum help to fight for global privacy and data protection? Obviously, you're keeping track, or you're trying to keep track of a lot of things that's going on, and where does the FPF try to comment or insert itself amongst that process?
Well, we have a truly wonderful team of experts, and we are indeed keeping track of everything that we can. We engage with corporate actors, with policymakers, with advocates, and we're trying. This is the forum part of our name, right? And
Hmm.
we're trying to have everybody sit around the same table and exchange opinions and reach consensus for the things they care about when it comes to collecting personal information, using personal information, processing it in a specific way. And we also publish guidance, infographics, white papers. I will give you an example, which I think will be actually quite useful for some of your listeners. My colleagues Brenda Young and Sarah Jordan just published the other week a very short sort of primer on AI and
Mm,
dispelling, what AI means. If we are going to talk about how AI impacts or will impact our life, we should know what exactly are we talking about.
sure.
Algorithmic decision making, machine learning, what type of machine learning, because there are different types that require different sets of processing operations to happen. And it's a very, very non-technical friendly, very small primer on how to better understand this technology so we know better how to deal with it. And then one other example, just very recently this week, in any case, we released principles for contact tracing technologies that include privacy protection, but also diversity and equity considerations. And we released these principles in partnership with 6 or 7 other equity-focused organizations. And we hope that universities, organizations, campuses, counties, cities that plan on deploying contact tracing technologies will have a look at them and will take them into account.
Cool. Is this the, were you talking about the Spectrum of AI companion to the FPF
Yes,
AI infographic?
That
Or
is
I
exactly
guess the
it.
infographic itself. So I guess I gotta find. I'd have
So
to
the
find the.
infographic is the very short, fun version of it, and then the white paper accompanying it, with which was just released, kind of gives more detail about what you see in the infographic. But this is a really very helpful tool for everyone that wants to understand a bit better what we are talking about when we say AI, because it's such a super big encompassing notion.
Yeah, for anybody who's listening and is like, I want to see this infographic. I think it looks like it was released December 14th, 2020. So that's go to fpf.org, go to issues, AI and machine learning. Scroll down a little bit. You'll find the infographic published by Brenda Leong, Spectrum of AI or Artificial Intelligence and Infographic Tool. And then, like you said, there's that the companion to the infographic that was just released as of this recording 3 days ago. So that's
Yes.
very timely. Maybe I'll print that off and have it for some cottage reading next week.
Well, I think it will make for a great cottage reading. Yeah, and in fact, if I may still advertise some of the cool stuff that FPF is doing,
Please.
we are known in the privacy bubble for publishing these very useful infographics. We are trying to distill super complex notions and concepts that privacy and data governance people work with, and create visuals that are helpful for privacy offices around the country, for specialists that work in the field. And you will find some on the identification. You'll find a very cool interactive one on smart cities. We have one on connected cars. There are several infographics, and we do plan on updating some of those, or coming up with new ideas on what to capture on infographics.
Cool. Yeah, this isn't very long. It's like if you print it off, it's like 18 pages total, not even front to back. So the PDF is really handy too. So yeah, definitely check that out. I think that's and the infographic is in the companion. So if you want a printed off version, that's all in there. That's cool. Um, Good. So like then what's on the horizon? So you've got after this question I want to come back to that Spanish company, the Spanish supermarket a little bit. But what's on the horizon for the rest of this year and what do you see coming in 2022? It sounds like there's a lot more data protection laws coming up. I know Canada has been reviewing. I don't think we've passed one yet, but our federal government
No.
has been looking at one. We do have PIPEDA and PIPEDA, which apply to data generally, and then one specifically for electronic health records. And those have been in place for a long time, but I think it's been 15 or 20 years. Like,
They're due for an update, I would say.
yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. So, do you see more refreshes coming from countries who already have them? Do you see, are there any very specific jurisdictions, like large, impactful jurisdictions, who you think are going to bring one forward in the next little while?
Absolutely. There are a couple of jurisdictions that are top of mind for me and my team around this time of the year. So, first of all, there's China. You wouldn't
Mhm.
believe the type of developments that are happening in China.
I would
Uh,
believe because I've been paying attention to those. I was going to
yes.
ask you about China specifically. I listened to a podcast called Daily Tech News Show, and they actually have been covering the controversy, the amount of intervention the um, Communist Party of China has been engaging in recently
Mm-hmm.
with a variety of private organizations. So, but please go ahead.
And you are absolutely right to pay attention to what's happening there. So, China is about to very soon, sometime this August, and very likely adopt their own version of a GDPR, which is called the Personal Information Protection Law, PIPL. It was published as a bill in October of last year, and then it went very
Okay.
quickly through the process there. And this will be applicable to all the private sector. And if the drafts that we're seeing will pass, apparently at least some of it will be applicable to the public sector as well. And of course, there's a lot of skepticism in policy circles about how that will actually,
Yeah.
come to be. But
Very
it's
skeptical.
happening. It's happening, and this is only one small piece of a very, very broad tech policy. I
Revamp,
wouldn't dare exactly
overhaul.
revamp.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dare call it a revolution, but I would say it's definitely a lot more than the free for all that was for Chinese companies in the past years in terms of gathering data, which allowed them to become so competitive. But now what we're seeing is a lot of pedaling back from the government towards that attitude, and a lot of new regulations on all sorts of sectors that are being proposed. This broad, general, comprehensive law that will apply to all processing of personal information. We're seeing already enforcement of some of these laws and different types of ordinances and very small
Hmm.
pieces of the puzzle that we're seeing there against some of the very big players. And also, what I found very interesting in the past weeks is that municipalities and regions are starting to pass their own data protection laws. Like very recently,
Yeah.
Shenzhen
Yep.
actually passed their own data protection law before even this PIPL was passed at federal level. And it has some interesting elements. We didn't really have the time to do a deep dive, but from the summaries we looked at, it has some very interesting elements to it, like a huge focus on consent for when it comes to mobile apps and what they can collect, and so on. One very relevant development, and it's the last one that I will mention when we're talking of China, is that the Supreme Court over there recently, in the past week, published guidelines for courts on how to deal with facial recognition cases.
Mm.
And this is quite interesting because this means that there seems to be a need in the judicial, world over there to know how to deal with facial recognition cases and how
Yeah.
to enforce the relevant laws, which means that citizens are probably bringing cases, right? And this very detailed guidance that the Supreme Court published pushes a lot on the of option of consent for facial recognition, of course, in the commercial area, and
Yeah.
requiring notice and requiring some sort of opt-ins for people. So that's going
Yeah.
to be interesting to see how it plays out in real life, of course.
Definitely. I think my general sense is that the Communist Party of China feels capitalism, private companies got way ahead of where they thought they were going to get and have now too much power in comparison to where the government would like them to be. Um, and so, yeah, they're really laying the hammer down in a variety of ways to pull things back. Recently, WeChat even was prevented from registering any new members for I think 6 days, while some obtuse an investigation of some kind was done into the type of data that WeChat, which is owned by Tencent, is collecting and how it's being processed and all that. I don't think any of this is really going to apply to municipalities or certainly the federal government. Very little of it, at least, especially things around the consent for facial recognition.
Oh
But yeah, they're
yes,
definitely laying it down on the private companies, and so even the big ones like Tencent, um, Alibaba, and others are definitely feeling the heat. It's been really interesting to hear at least the big situations that happen, and make the headlines here as
yes.
well. Come over the last
Um,
6 months or so, maybe a year.
Yes, there's also a very interesting case with the well, against Didi Chunsing. I'm sorry if
Didi
I'm not
Chuxing,
pronouncing
yeah,
it. Yes, I'm not pronouncing it
something like
correctly,
that.
indeed. And it's very yes, it's very very interesting what happened in this case because indeed. So this is a ride-hailing company. Think
Yeah,
of an
it's like Uber but for
Uber-like
China.
business, exactly. And it was just after its IPO on the New York, I think it was the New York market,
I
but
think
in
so.
any case, an IPO here in the US. An investigation started into its data practices it was triggered under some national security mandate, and that raised a lot of red flags for all of the Chinese companies that were looking to, go on foreign
Have a
markets.
public offering. Yeah.
Indeed, and that investigation actually had to do also with data. So this is why we paid attention to it, and my colleague Hunter Dorwart, who is our policy analyst for China, and I published this analysis recently on FPF's blog, where we are explaining why this decision is unprecedented, decision to start investigating Didi, and some of the elements that we think shine a light on China's future approach to enforcing data-related laws. One of the takeaways that we thought was very interesting, maybe intriguing, is that Didi was considered to be a critical infrastructure information company, which allowed the triggering of this particular investigation. And this
Hmm.
is interesting because if you think about it, would you think like a Uber or a Lyft is critical infrastructure? I'm not sure, you know.
Critical infrastructure, definitely not. Critical information infrastructure
Yeah,
is
that's the word.
different, and still,
Yes.
regardless, like, no, like, yeah, Uber, Lyft, a bunch of European or French specific ones I saw 2 weeks ago as
Yes,
well.
indeed,
I was like,
indeed.
oh, look, they have like their own Bolt or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess
So
on
that's
you could
interesting, you know?
on the one hand, they are collecting a lot of traffic data, right? Almost like Google Maps,
Yes.
where or Waze, where if you're running it, that data is getting all fed back, running algorithms. Is traffic fast? Is traffic slow? So yeah, I guess I could kind of see where that might be. Now, critical, I mean, the way I apply that term or the Canadian government applies that term, no. Important, significant, sure. Critical, no. That to me is
Yes.
has a very specific meaning when it comes to government related stuff. And so I would hesitate to apply that specific label to Didi Shuxing, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing properly anyway. But just I'm sure
Yes,
people
yes.
who know Asian languages better than I do say Didi Shuxing, and so that's just the way I've taken to pronouncing it. But anyway, please go ahead.
So that was one of our very interesting takeaways. Then this is relevant because in this future PIPL that I was mentioning, there are some very specific obligations for critical information
Mm,
infrastructure companies. So then, this actually has companies on the alert because who knows whether you're a critical information infrastructure company or not.
yeah.
And there's a lot of ambiguity on how these notions are almost not defined. I mean, there's almost like a non-definition in the regulations that operate or are being proposed in the data space. So then it's important to sort of pay attention to this type of big signals or signals of enforcement that we are starting to see, because this sort of opens a window towards what do these laws really want to achieve. So that's one thing. Then another thing we thought was very interesting is that presuming that the most valuable data Didi has is actually location data, right? Traffic
Hmm.
and, location data, in
Yeah.
fact. Um, Also, it seems that this data is considered to be something called important data, which again, in other pieces of the puzzle, has additional obligations attached to it. And again, a lack of clarity of what important data is. So we are thinking that location data will most likely be part of this important data. And then, of course, there's the general conclusion that it seems that these data laws and their enforcement are used as a lever to achieve other type of public policy goals that the Chinese government has.
Yeah.
because it's actually quite natural to assume that that IPO was one of the main problems. At least this is what policy circles agree on. But then the actual tool used, the lever used, was this cybersecurity investigation that the government can start against the critical information infrastructure company. So you see, all of this are actually very, very interesting pieces of the puzzle. And China is absolutely a fascinating jurisdiction to look at right now in terms of data laws. And then to complete the picture, we're also looking at India, which has been trying to pass a general privacy law, data protection law for the past 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
It seems to constantly be postponed in the parliament. If As of right now, it seems that November is the month when we will see amendments to the initial bill that was put on the agenda of the parliament. A special committee worked on amendments in the past 2 years or so, and they were supposed to publish their updated bill already for more than a year and a half, I believe, and they kept asking for
More time.
new time,
Yeah.
yes, more time. So now we're looking at November. And if they will indeed pass this law, and if China passes its law, this is going to be really like a huge moment for data protection as a concept and as a legal field generally, because all of
Yeah.
a sudden 2.6 billion people ish, will be covered by this type of provisions in
Hmm.
this type of law.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Like that's almost a third of the world's population just under those two countries who, I get, depending on the makeup, could be impacted by really significant, hopefully good, generally speaking, data protection laws, or really bad ones. Um,
Yes.
I guess it really depends on the final makeup. And going back to what you said about, this lack of clarity over what critical means and what important means in the Chinese PIPL, there are few things corporations hate more than ambiguity when it comes to legislation. So I can only imagine the the oh, what am I looking for, the nervousness and the anxiety, that's playing out around Tencent's, board of directors, and Didi Chuxing's board of directors, and Alibaba's, etc. Especially given, Alibaba's big into Ali Cloud, which is running the Olympics um, video feeds right now for all
Oh.
broadcasters. Yeah, they got the contract, and they're providing the feeds to CBC, NBC, TSN, France 24, probably, all these RAI International, probably in Italy, all these broadcasters who are carrying, or Sky Sports maybe in the UK, who are carrying the feeds. It's all the same feed worldwide, and it's coming through Alibaba's cloud server infrastructure. So um, they're certainly trying to make a name for themselves. All right.
Yeah.
Where
And
are Go ahead, go ahead.
Well, having said that, just just to put it out there, if we are walking on the entire geography of the world right now, I can tell you something about what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Latin America. I would say everywhere you're looking on a globe, there is some tech policy, data related legislation being passed, or some framework to enforce very new
Mhm.
legislation that had been adopted in the past years, being right now built. So there's literally, I think the world came to understand the impact that data, automated decision making based on data, and new technologies can have on individuals and their communities. And it seems that almost everyone is grappling now with the right balance to strike, you know.
Can we hit really quick on maybe some African, South American, maybe some Caribbean countries? Only because they get so little coverage. This
Yes,
this part of the
absolutely.
world, and where you live now, I'm sure they get very little coverage. Like, where where are the good policies that might be passed, or maybe some recent enforcement happening in the Caribbean, South America, or Africa, now or coming up?
So let's look a bit at Africa. So South Africa just had its law, which actually it adopted about 7 years ago. And then it had sort of entered into force in waves,
Okay.
just had the last part of it entering into force this summer, which means that now the entire Personal Information Protection Act there, actually it's POPIA, that's POPIA, that's the short
Okay.
for it. I don't remember the long version of it.
That's fine.
Entered fully into force. So now there is a lot of attention on South Africa and how this law will maybe have an impact there, and how will it be enforced. And then the jurisdiction where we might see a law soon is Nigeria.
Mm,
A bill has been proposed in the past 2 years. I haven't heard anything new around that bill, but I know that there has been a debate about adopting a data protection law, also inspired by the GDPR and sort of the European Union's framework on these issues. And it's sort of waiting to happen, in
okay.
Nigeria, which is also a very big jurisdiction and a very big market if we're looking at
Yeah.
it.
70
Um,
million, I think, something like that. 70 million
Something like
people.
that. And
Yeah.
not only that, but it actually has an emerging tech scene, which is very
Yeah.
interesting to see. There are a lot of startups, and there's a really an emerging tech scene by all definitions. Then, if we're looking at Latin America, I would say the most relevant and consequential developments that are happening there are happening in Brazil. Brazil very recently passed their version of the General Data Protection Regulation, their General Data Protection Law, LGPD, and it became applicable last fall. So
Okay.
that's since then. The Brazilians have been working a lot on making it effective. They've set up a data protection authority which has been very active in the past months, and they're trying to find a way to have this law actually being enforced. Also relying on some of their consumer protection commissioners and prosecutors, in fact, in the territory, entering collaboration agreements with this new data protection authority.
Mm,
So
hmm.
there's really a lot happening there, with the Constitutional Court also last year recognizing data protection as a constitutional right different than
Mm.
privacy, which will be consequential on the long term for
Yeah.
Brazilians.
Interesting. By the way, I was way off on the population of Nigeria. It's almost 212 million. So my apologies to any Nigerians or anybody
And mine
nearby
too,
who was
because
like,
I agreed.
Derek, you're so far off. Like that, like three times off. Literally about three times off the population. My apologies. Um, Brazil also has a very significant population of, I'm pretty sure, well over 100 million. So yeah, these are very large jurisdictions, also large diasporas, but still certainly very large populations at home, and very quickly developing countries. So it would actually be really interesting to see what impact this has now before these technology sectors really take off. You're right about Nigeria. We've had a few Nigerian individuals on the show, and I speak with some Nigerians every single day, and so I do get some insight into the burgeoning tech scene there. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens in contrast with Canada, Europe, US, or California at least, where data protection laws come in way after the fact, and China too, as opposed to kind of right in the middle of this
Yep.
surge, renaissance, whatever you want to call it, of these local tech scenes really taking off, and the entrepreneurialism
Yes,
happening
yes,
there.
indeed. Something
Um,
like that. Yeah.
yeah. Cool.
Well, to be entirely fair, there are already some rules in place in Nigeria, but they come from the executive branch. Think of an executive
Oh,
order
okay.
type of thing.
Could be
And
changed at any time then.
what they're looking for, and they were trying to do is actually have the parliament pass a law. Yeah, I
Yeah,
just wanted
which is
to
always,
to
yeah,
be
always
more
more forceful.
precise. Yes.
Yes, yeah. We don't have that's something that's really interesting in comparison with Canada, where there are certain there are there are regulations that only a provincial or the federal cabinet need to need to agree to modify at any one point in time. But most things are regulated by laws, and so it needs to go through the whole House of Commons or the provincial legislature in order to be adopted, or introduced, adopted, modified, etc. So, and then of course you have the Constitution, which is a whole other thing, and that's very difficult to make changes to. I think pretty much anywhere, but especially here, especially in countries where you have distinct lower levels of government that have to agree, or a majority, super majority often have to agree to make changes. So cool.
Yes.
Um, we need to wrap up here. But I want to get two hopefully quick questions in, if that's all right with you. Um,
Go ahead.
right now we're in this place where health passports, vaccine passports, digital or decentralized identities, and probably intersecting with those are becoming a thing. I effectively had one while I was in France in order to get into some venues because laws changed and were introduced right before I got there. Um, Thankfully, they made the process easy, but regardless, I had an app that had a bunch of data about me stored in it. What are some of the data protection challenges you think we're going to face with digital IDs, and maybe parlay that with vaccine passports and the sort of thing that's happening in France, Quebec now saying that they're going to do it, and probably some U.S. states as well and elsewhere.
And I do believe actually Ontario has a digital ID scheme, not like passport, health passport
Yeah,
related for
no,
COVID,
we have
but a
something.
digital ID initiative. Because I know this because one of my very good friends from FPF, Chelsea Colbert, who is our lead on connected cars and mobility, is actually from Ontario. So
Ah,
we had a conversation about this some time ago, and she was saying that this digital ID framework is being proposed in Ontario, and I would say there are two different discussions to have here. One is on digital ID, and this is something that's very complex, and a lot of people are still figuring it out right now as we speak. How could this be, how can we make it work in a way that actually complies with fundamental rights? And this is, for example, a debate that's taking place right now in Europe as well, because the European Union proposed a digital ID regulation this year, which means that it's likely in the next couple of years, or in the next years in any case, for all Europeans to have a digital ID. But this is
right,
not like the vaccine passports conversation is different, and the health passports conversation is kind of different. We know that you will have sensitive data there, so the sort of there is a heightened risk of bad things happening if that data is shared with anyone by
right,
whomever gets it.
right,
So there needs to be a lot of safeguards in place for vaccine passports and other type of COVID-related health passports, for them to be respectful of people's rights. But that being said, this doesn't mean it cannot happen. So it's actually possible, if you're looking at some of the frameworks that are out there, to have respectful of rights digital health passports to be able to manage the pandemic. So you can have a limited retention time. You can deploy the identification techniques on the data that's being collected. You can limit absolutely the actors with whom data is shared, and you should always use the data for the purposes for which it was collected, and
Yeah.
not all of a sudden find yourself in a place where your vaccination data is used for who knows what in the future. Yeah, so that's the shortest version of the answer I could give to that
That's
question.
fine. That's fine. And maybe in situations where you are dealing with people who are in sensitive situation, or maybe you're traveling to a country where you don't feel super confident that your data is being protected. What sort of things do you do in order to protect your data or your privacy online?
It's there are there's the classical advice, like use a VPN, for example, if you are on your laptop.
Yeah.
Use encrypted text messaging services. Use two-factor authentication, and make sure you use that for your accounts when you are in the territory of that country.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things that I'm not actually a specialist in, but I always try to read about and take into account from the people that are much more sort of data security focused.
Cool. All right. Fair enough. Dr. Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna, thank you so much for your time here on Private Podcast today. I think everybody learned a lot, and it was really nice to chat with you about everything we went through here. So thanks a lot for your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye bye.